everyone. Um, so the work that the resource that I've been thinking about has been interesting work for me to really try to understand this whole issue and all of this myself because I don't come to this as someone who has a lot of experience using Gen AI, and I understand the importance of helping students to understand it, which also means it's really important for us to understand it, right? So I think I just want to start by saying this activity, like developing this resource, working on it, was such a perfect example of the very thing I'm talking about, which is the value in writing as a process, right? So the thing that I imagine with this is it's a short article or short reading that in my mind might appear on a website, for example, a web page where we have all of these resources together. And it could be something that students encounter on their own, but it also could be a reading that instructors, for example, writing instructors at the beginning of the semester might want to direct students to, just to get them to read and start to engage this conversation. Because I think what's really most important to me is helping students to understand that figuring out how to use generative AI in as part of their writing process takes work, right? It's not just a tool that's available and so you use it or you don't use it. So we really need to work this process of mapping out how to do it. So I imagine, the heading might be generative AI in writing, and then there's a number of resources connected to it, including some of the things we're already working on. So the short article that I'm working on right now is called The Possibilities and Perils of Gen AI for Writing. So I'm just going to kind of go through an outline of that and point out some things that I think were particularly interesting for me to learn actually as I was going through that process. Okay, so I start with, as an introduction, this fundamental premise that I would invite students to accept, basically, and that's that learning is our number one priority, right? It's really helping to have the students understand that we're not here just for transactional reasons, right? We all understand at this point that you can have a number of different Gen AI chatbots spit out an essay for you in a matter of minutes. And so if the goal was really to understand that assignments equal grades equal a degree, sure. But really what we're trying to do is help them to understand that they're in college, they're at this incredible institution, and they have this profound opportunity for intellectual and social development. Like, really, they're here to learn and to become better human beings, and human beings who can make a positive impact on the world. And so there are questions we have to ask about whether using Gen AI is going to contribute to that or going to undermine that. So really, I think there are two fundamental questions, two key questions I would invite students to ask anytime they wanted to consider using Gen AI for writing or for any learning task, actually. Number one, will using Gen AI for this task deepen my learning, not only in the short term, but more importantly in the long run? And number two, is this task ideal for cognitive offloading? In other words, is it something that AI can help me with or handle for me with no risk of loss to my cognitive or intellectual growth? If the answer is not yes to one of those questions, it seems fairly clear to me that if learning is your goal, then you should not be using Gen AI for that task, right? So that's kind of the premise that I'm starting with, right? Is understanding, is this going to deepen your learning or not? And then I get into the possibilities and the perils of using Gen AI for writing. And this is still developing, but I'll just say that these are some of the sections or the bullet points that I'm working with at the moment. um, so some students articulate, and I think some instructors even articulate that it might be okay to use Gen AI as like a blank page breaker or something that will help them in the brainstorming process. Like if you're paralyzed with writer's block, AI can help you generate initial ideas, make suggestions to get you started. So I know that there are some faculty who believe that's an appropriate place to use it, and I certainly know there are students who do. And so even if that's not something that I would do, I put that there as a point of conversation to engage, but also being clear to add the caveat that if the goal is to help your own ideas get flowing, sometimes it's important. In fact, I might argue that it's always important to push yourself to do that hard work, that brainstorming process is important. And so that's where I would direct students to or readers to another resource that we're working on developing, that Tara is actually working on developing, about challenging a popular misconception and sort of the pros and cons of using AI for brainstorming. So, in other words, I'm just trying to introduce that concept here, right? And then kind of direct them to think a little bit more deeply about that rather than assuming that it's okay. Also, the idea of a devil's advocate. So the idea with this, and I've actually seen this as a suggestion on a number of different sites and heard other people talking about it, but this idea that you might do all of the work of drafting first and then share that writing, share that draft with your whatever tool you're using, whatever chatbot you're using, but to ask if to give it a prompt that says something like briefly outline any strong counter arguments to the claim. And the thinking behind this kind of approach is that it might force you to strengthen your own logic or critical thinking and address those gaps. I all of these possibilities, I'll say, I sort of come back to in the peril section in certain ways, but there are possibilities with this, which I think is kind of the point. I'm not setting out to just write a piece that says just don't even consider using it, right? It's really about thinking through the possibilities. And then two other ways that are possible. I'm using it as a research assistant. Um, for example, using Notebook LM, and maybe that's a good place to link to some of our resources about using Notebook LM. And maybe an approach, for example, like explaining the topic you're trying to better understand, but then asking if there are some specific keywords, theories, or scholars associated with the topic. So then you use those keywords to go into NYU libraries and do the work yourself, right? Because there are some issues with asking LLMs to just find articles for you, the possibility of hallucinations, you not thinking through the work yourself, et cetera. So again, like figuring out how to use this as a way to really just kind of scaffold the process and get you to a place where then you're doing the work yourself. And then finally, using it as a citation assistant. We all know how laborious it can be to do our citations, but then also adding a note about how important it is to actually be the one providing the source information and verifying every single citation against the actual text, highlighting that there are issues with just asking LLMs to produce it for you, and how that really can be a setup for false information, really, and just inaccurate formatting, right? So really trying to take this as an opportunity to get students to double check everything and make that a constant practice. I will say something that was very interesting to me in writing this is that I've heard many people suggest that you could use, sorry, Tim, I'm just going to say one that I don't have on there, but I'll explain why. And that is the idea of using it as a writing tutor. So I have read many, in many places, a suggestion that students might avoid, obviously, using it as an editor, and I'll talk about that in a minute in the perils, but that they could use it as a writing tutor, where they might feed their paper that they've already written to an LLM and say, could you look at this paper and tell me, pick out three primary grammatical errors I'm making, or three issues you see, and help me to, don't fix it for me, but help me to understand what I'm doing wrong and kind of teach it to me. So this idea of using it as sort of a study buddy or something. So I actually started to add this as a possibility until I looked more into it and found the studies that are showing that that actually can be counterproductive. In particular, there's a Wharton study that many people have been talking about recently that came out and showed that even using it as a writing tutor, so in the study, students were given a modified ChatGPT version that would only act as a tutor, not an editor. So there was a group that used no AI, a group that had unlimited access to ChatGPT, and a group that had this modified version, this writing tutor version. The use of ChatGPT, unlimited use, and the writing tutor use ended up being counterproductive to the student's development as a writer. So even the writing tutor use, several papers later or down the road, was counterproductive. It was the students who did not have access to these tools for writing their papers that ended up performing better in the medium term and long term, right? So I thought that was important to note. Okay, so if we move on to the perils then, some of these perils that I talk about are obviously just missed learning opportunities, which actually Tara has already talked about. And to me, it's really about highlighting for students that the missed learning opportunities is something personal, but it also potentially violates academic integrity standards, sort of thinking about academic integrity in a way that's different than how we used to think about it. And really understanding if you want to learn, you should not ask any LLMs to or any Gen AI tools to edit your papers, right? And pointing to some more studies about that kind of highlight the reasons why. Um, Cognitive atrophy, we're here to learn to think more, to get smarter, so to speak. So if you skip the drafting process, if we understand writing as a process where you learn, not just where you're demonstrating something that you know, if you skip that process, you actually skip the actual thinking, right? And again, there are studies that are looking at that, including a study, an ongoing study right now at the MIT Media Lab that shows lower brain connectivity, poor understanding, poor retention of what students just wrote, and so forth. So to me, this is an opportunity to not just kind of preach to students about perils, but to share some information and some research that they can follow up on their own, so they can create this map for themselves, really. Also, some notes about hallucinations, which I think we all understand, about false fluency, or this idea that AI writing often seems perfect, right? It might seem to students like it sounds really smart and grammatically perfect, but yet it's really intellectually hollow. So my suggestion there is that if you rely on Gen AI in your writing process, you need to ask yourself, if you were to present this paper in an oral defense, for example, how well would you be able to engage in a deep and meaningful conversation about what you just wrote, right? That students need to understand writing as understanding, not just producing something. And then finally, this concept of homogenization, which Martha is going to talk a little bit more about in a minute, and really highlighting there that LLMs like ChatGPT and Gemini are predictive engines based on averages, which means that the information and the writing that they produce is shaped by all of the writing and information, no matter how good, bad, accurate, or inaccurate that the models were built on. Sometimes students are surprised to hear that that means the data sets even include, for common LLMs, include not only scholarly and expert sources, but even more than that, information gleaned from Reddit posts, user reviews, and other non-expert sources. So it's not just a problem in terms of content, potentially. It's also a problem in terms of voice, which again, Martha will talk a little bit more about. And then finally, I end by wrapping it up by coming back to this idea of mapping and really trying to um, hammer home this idea that academic integrity is not just about following rules to avoid punishment anymore. It's really about protecting your own intellectual development, which I think really most students understand, but engaging the conversation about it is important. Um, and then I'll just close by reading the last couple of lines in the draft, at least, which read, as we all work to navigate this new digital landscape, it will take significant time, effort, and commitment to map out the best way forward. As you create your own map, keep in mind the many possibilities and perils that Gen AI presents on your journey as a college student. That's all. Thank you.